the real Bardia. There is almost no information about Xerxes' life before he became king at the age of 32 in 486 BC. In his biography of Xerxes, the British historian Richard Stoneman used the education of Cyrus, the partly fictionalized biography of Cyrus the Great by the Athenian general and writer Xenophon from the early 4th century BC, as the basis for Xerxes' education and upbringing. The core elements of a Persian noble's military education included horsemanship and fighting with bow and spear on foot and on horseback. Noble children were taught the main principle of Zoroastrianism, the empire's state religion. Based on the teachings of the semi-mythical prophet Zoroaster, Zoroastrians worshipped one supreme god, Ahura Mazda, who created the world and used truth to give it order. Ahura Mazda is involved in a constant struggle against Ahriman, the evil spirit responsible for falsehoods. Persian princes like Xerxes would therefore have been taught to consider telling the truth a sacred obligation, with lying and deceit equivalent to heresy. While Zoroaster's teachings formed a key part of the Persian state religion, especially during the reigns of Darius and Xerxes, the Persians continued to believe in a wide pantheon of traditional gods, though their drift towards quasi-monotheism was a striking forerunner of what would occur with Christianity in the Eastern Mediterranean centuries later. According to the first Alcibiades, a Socratic dialogue loosely attributed to the Greek philosopher Plato, Persian princes were brought up by eunuchs until the age of 14, when they would begin receiving lessons from tutors chosen from the aristocracy. As the Persians had a strong oral tradition, there is no indication that Xerxes would have been taught to read and write, and anything that needed to be recorded in writing was done by imperial scribes. At the age of 16 or 17, young Persian nobles would then spend a period of 10 years practicing military drills and going hunting. From their mid-20s, they would serve as the king's soldiers before transferring to civil and administrative roles in their early 50s. Xerxes' mother, Atossa, had a major influence on his life, and she may have been behind his marriage to Amestris, the daughter of Atanes, the man who had helped Darius in his coup of 522 BC. The ancient sources are silent about Amestris's childhood and upbringing, nor do they give any dates for her marriage to Xerxes. Xerxes' father's empire was vast. It was only founded in 559 BC by Cyrus the Great, when he led his followers from Persis, a region corresponding to Fars province in the south of modern-day Iran, westwards to conquer the Babylonian Empire in Mesopotamia in modern-day Iraq. Over the next years, the Persians continued to expand in all directions, though primarily to the west. By the early 540s BC, the Persians had reached the borders of the realms of King Croesus of Lydia in what is now Turkey. There, they occupied his capital of Sardis in 547 BC, extending Cyrus's emerging empire to the Aegean. This might have led to an immediate clash between the Persians and the hundreds of small Greek city-states that ringed the Aegean Sea, including the coastline of western Turkey, but instead, Cyrus turned his attentions elsewhere, completing his conquest of the Babylonians and their lands in places like Syria and the Levant. His son and successor, Cambyses II, then looked further southwestwards and campaigned into Egypt. By the time Xerxes' father Darius came to the throne, the Persian Empire stretched from Egypt all the way east to parts of Central Asia and from the Black Sea south to northern Arabia. Though it was a decentralized empire ruled by individual junior kings or satraps who paid homage to Darius and would do so to Xerxes as well one day when he succeeded his father. Shortly before that accession would occur, Darius turned his eyes to the Greeks of the Aegean. Though there was no individual power within the Greek world that could in any way match the Persians militarily, the Greeks were still a powerful people, having colonized large parts of the Mediterranean and Black Sea and become rich from their extensive trade and commerce. From amongst them, the Athenians were the emerging mercantile and naval power, though the Spartans of the Peloponnese were regarded as the most proficient military warriors of the known world. In the 500s and 490s BC, Darius had begun slowly conquering some of the Greek city-states of the Ionian coast of Anatolia in western Turkey. Some of these revolted against Persian rule in 498 BC, leading several of the more powerful Greek city-states further to the west on the Greek mainland to send aid to them, notably the Athenians. The Persians responded with a series of punitive campaigns targeting the Ionian city-states, and by 493 BC, the rebellion had been fully extinguished. The following year, Darius decided that his vengeance had not gone far enough, and attempted to conquer the whole of the Greek world by sending an invasion force under the Persian general Mardonius. While Mardonius managed to secure the submission of Thrace and Macedonia in northern Greece, a storm near Mount Athos resulted in the loss of hundreds of ships and forced him to turn back. Unperturbed, in 490 BC, Darius ordered a new naval campaign across the Aegean, one which ended with the unexpected Athenian victory at the Battle of Marathon east of Athens itself. Yet, while the first Persian invasion of Greece had failed, neither Darius nor his son would forget about the Greeks, and Xerxes became committed to launching a much more extensive military campaign against the people of the Aegean. In 486 BC, while Darius was planning another campaign against the Greek city-states, the king fell ill and died. Xerxes' path to the kingship was more straightforward than his father's, although it had not been uncontested. Xerxes had 3 elder half-brothers from Darius's first marriage, the eldest of whom, Artabazanes, also claimed he had a right to be his father's successor. Xerxes argued that he had the strongest claim to the throne, as he was the first of Darius's sons to be born when their father was already king, and that his mother Atossa had royal blood as the daughter of Cyrus the Great. According to Herodotus, the Persians did not follow the principle of the firstborn male son succeeding the father, and Darius had nominated Xerxes as his successor while preparing to go on his final campaign, though he adds that such was Atossa's influence at court that Xerxes would have become king in any case. While Herodotus claims that Darius had nominated Xerxes shortly before his death, reliefs on Darius's palaces in Persepolis already show Xerxes as crown prince, indicating that the nomination was made years in advance. Thus, Xerxes faced no internal opposition when he succeeded his father on the throne. The only ancient description of a Persian king's coronation is found in the Greek historian Plutarch's biography of King Artaxerxes II, the great-grandson of Xerxes I. We can extrapolate some ideas about how Xerxes' coronation was carried out from Plutarch's account. After a period of mourning for his late father that ended in Darius's burial at Persepolis, one of 4 Persian capitals, Xerxes was crowned king at nearby Pasargadae, Cyrus's capital and burial place in southern Iran. The ceremony may have been held at the shrine of the goddess Anahita, the Iranian goddess of wisdom and warfare. The eternal flame of the Zoroastrians that had been extinguished following Darius's death were lit once again. After being invested as king in a ceremony hidden from view inside the sanctuary, Xerxes would have placed upon his shoulders the robe of Cyrus the Great, before descending the stairs into the presence of the awaiting crowd. The ceremony was followed by a grand feast accompanied by music. The Persian court, which Xerxes now assumed to the height of, did not stay in a single location, and the king spent the year moving between 3 or 4 capitals. The king's summer capital was the old Median capital of Ecbatana, while in winter the court travelled to Susa, the capital of the former Elamite kingdom in southwestern Iran, which the Greeks considered the centre of Persian power. The king may have stayed in Persepolis for parts of the spring and autumn, and may have also spent part of the year in Babylon. The empire had an extensive road network to facilitate communication, and the Persian Royal Road enabled couriers to cover the 1,500 miles between Sardis and Susa within 3 months. With the exception of the Greek cities in the west, the empire's economy was predominantly agrarian. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote that Persian satraps accumulated wealth from land, local produce, herding, trade, and the collection of various dues and taxes, portions of which were then sent to the king. The empire's wealth was therefore concentrated with the king and in his capitals, contributing to the splendour and ostentation that the Greeks considered decadent. Although the Greeks saw the Persians as their great external enemy, from the core of the Persian Empire, the Greeks were little more than a nuisance on the distant western frontier who deserved to be taught a lesson when they rebelled against the king. While the Persian kings were autocratic rulers, no single individual could hope to govern such a large empire without many officials. In the case of the Persian Empire, the imperial staff consisted of some 15,000 people who accompanied the king as he moved between his capitals. The king sought advice on important political and military issues from a council of 7, many of whom came from noble families closely connected to the royal family. The system of satrapies allowed the king to project his power from his capitals to the provinces. In an effort to prevent the satraps from acting too independently and challenging the king's authority, Xerxes also appointed an official to shadow each satrap and ensure they were carrying out their functions properly. Another prominent part of the imperial staff were the eunuchs, whose primary function was to control access to the royal women. The king and his court were protected by an elite bodyguard known as the Immortals, who received their name from the fact that their strength always remained constant at 10,000 men, as every man killed in action was immediately replaced. The Immortals not only provided internal security for the king and his court, but served as an elite heavy infantry unit on the battlefield. Like Louis XIV at Versailles or the Chinese emperor in the Forbidden City, the daily life of Xerxes' court was designed to project an image of the king's greatness and power among his subjects and foreign dignitaries. Every morning, Xerxes put on his imperial robes and mounted his throne in the audience hall, where he was attended to by the Chiliarch, the senior official who managed the court proceedings. The king received petitioners from all over the empire, many of whom had to wait several days at the palace gate before being admitted to the king's presence. Most subjects were obliged to prostrate themselves in front of the king, a practice that was vehemently resisted by the Greeks, who developed a face-saving formula of pretending that they had dropped a ring before throwing themselves to the floor. The sense of grandeur was further enhanced by the palace gardens, and the creation of gardens as a representation of paradise has been a constant feature of Near Eastern empires throughout history, the most famous example being the enigmatic hanging gardens of Babylon. While some Persian princes are recorded as being personally involved in the cultivation of their gardens, there is no evidence that Xerxes himself was so hands-on. One of the best-known episodes in Xerxes' life involves his fondness for a particular tree in Sardis, which Herodotus described as of such beauty that the king was moved to decorate it with golden ornaments and to leave behind one of the immortals to guard it. Soon after coming to the throne in 486 BC, Xerxes faced a revolt in Egypt and sent an army to put it down. Herodotus gives few details of the campaign, other than Xerxes installed his brother, Achaemenes, as satrap of Egypt. According to the Greek historian Ctesias, writing during the late 5th century BC, Xerxes also faced two separate revolts in Babylon led by kings named Belshazzar and Shamash-Ariba. The first was put down by an army led by the Persian general Megabyzus, while the second was put down by Xerxes himself. While there is some uncertainty about the dating of the two rebellions, many scholars believe that both took place within a 3-month period in the summer of 484 BC. After Xerxes recaptured Babylon in October, the Persian authorities attempted to secure its control of the region by suppressing the leading families of Babylon who had supported the rebel kings, before dividing the Babylonian satrapy into smaller administrative units to undermine any sense of shared identity among inhabitants of the old Babylonian kingdom. While Xerxes is traditionally believed to have sacked Babylon and its temples, taking away a prominent statue of the Babylonian god Marduk, more recent scholarship argues that this is a misinterpretation of Herodotus and there was no widespread destruction of the city. After suppressing these revolts, Xerxes was free to turn his attention to Greece for the first time in his reign and avenge the slights which his father had suffered in the 490s BC. According to Herodotus, Xerxes convened a council at Susa in around 483 BC to discuss the prospect of another invasion of Greece. The main spokesman in favor of war was Mardonius, Xerxes' cousin and leader of the 492 BC invasion, who hoped to become satrap of Greece once it was conquered. Mardonius also claimed that the Greeks were ignorant about war and only fought on the open field, meaning that the Persians were guaranteed victory due to superior numbers. Mardonius's arguments failed to take into account the Persian defeat at Marathon, and Xerxes' uncle Artabanus argued against going to war with the Greeks, since the Greek fleet would cut him off from his supply lines. While Xerxes reacted angrily to the suggestion that he could not gain victory, he had second thoughts, and it was only after he had multiple dreams telling him to launch the invasion that he chose to do so. The exiled king of Sparta, Demaratus, seems to have been part of these discussions, as he sent a secret message to his homeland warning the Spartans to expect a Persian invasion. Rather than an early warning for his former subjects, Demaratus's message might also have been intended to intimidate the Spartans into submission. Xerxes was not planning on surprising the Greeks, since he spent the next 2 years making extensive preparations for the campaign. Bridges were built over rivers in Thrace to facilitate the passage of the army, and a canal was dug through the Athos Peninsula to give the fleet a safer passage to avoid a repeat of Mardonius's disaster in 492 BC. By the spring of 481 BC, Xerxes and his army left Susa and proceeded to Sardis. After arriving there in the autumn of 481 BC, Xerxes and his army spent the winter taking on provisions until they were ready to move by the spring of 480 BC. While Greek writers, including Herodotus, claimed that Xerxes had millions of men in his army at this juncture, more realistic estimates suggest that the invasion force could not have been more than 200,000 men, though even this figure would have represented an enormous invasion force in the 5th century BC. The king's multinational army, including peoples as diverse as Libyans and Indians, in addition to the Greeks in Asia Minor, who were subjects of the Persian Empire. Each of these national contingents had their own distinctive dress and equipment, and all of these different peoples, marching under Xerxes' command, served as a demonstration of his claim to be king of the whole world. The core of the army were the Persians and Medes, in addition to the legendary 10,000 immortals, commanded by Hydarnes, a nobleman whose father of the same name had been one of Darius's co-conspirators in the coup that delivered him the throne decades earlier. The commanders on land and sea were drawn from the royal family, with Mardonius holding senior command of the army and Xerxes' elder half-brother Ariobanes as commander of the fleet. Herodotus claims that the Persian fleet consisted of 3,000 ships, including more than 1,200 triremes, the most popular form of warship in the ancient Mediterranean, named after the 3 banks of oars that gave them speed and agility in war. The largest naval contingents included the Egyptians, Palestinians, and Phoenicians, an ancient people from modern-day Lebanon who were well known for their maritime prowess. Perhaps the most famous naval commander among the Persian allies was Queen Artemisia of Caria, who ruled Herodotus's native city of Halicarnassus and its surrounding islands, and commanded 5 ships. Artemisia was one of many Greek leaders who lived under Persian rule and contributed to Xerxes' invasion force. Despite attempts by Herodotus to present the conflict as a struggle between the autocratic Persians and the freedom-loving Greeks, it is probable that there were more Greeks fighting in Xerxes' army than those who remained independent and resisted the Persian invasion. Whether as a result of Demaratus's message or otherwise, the Greeks were well aware of Persian intentions, and representatives of the major Greek city-states met at the Isthmus of Corinth in the summer of 481 BC to form a coalition to resist Xerxes. While a total of 31 city-states joined the coalition, around half of these were Sparta's allies in its long-standing military alliance, known as the Peloponnesian League. Several important Greek states, such as Thebes and Argos, favoured negotiating with the Persians, but both Athens and Sparta were adamant that they needed to be resisted at all costs, and that Xerxes' great army could be defeated. The Spartans were led by their 2 kings, Leotychidas and Leonidas, while Themistocles emerged as the most prominent military leader among the Athenians over the course of the war. After leaving Sardis, Xerxes is said to have stopped at the fabled city of Troy on the coastline of western Turkey and to have listened there to tales of the Trojan War, though this story was almost certainly just a literary device used by Herodotus to associate the Persian wars with the heroic age of Achilles and Hector, which also saw a clash between the European Greeks and the Trojans of Asia Minor. The army then marched west towards the Hellespont, the body of water separating Europe from Asia. Although a couple of pontoon bridges had been built earlier in the spring as part of the military preparations, they had been damaged by a storm. In an infamous episode, an enraged Xerxes not only ordered the execution of the chief engineers, but ordered his men to give the Hellespont 300 lashes. While this reaction is the subject of Greek mockery, it is consistent with Persian religious and political ideology, which regarded the king as the ruler of the natural elements. The king was punishing the sea for a hostile act in the same manner that he would punish rebellious subjects. While the bridges were being rebuilt, Xerxes arranged sporting competitions for his soldiers and followed the proceedings from a hill overlooking the straits. Once the bridge was repaired, the great Persian army crossed the Hellespont into Thrace. There, Xerxes conducted a final review of it at Dariscus, located near the modern-day border between Greece and Turkey, before the march began. After heading west into Macedonia, where he may have called on King Alexander I of Macedon to resupply his armies, Xerxes began his march south against the independent Greek states. While Xerxes had made extensive preparations to facilitate his army's progress through northern Greece, there were no attempts to improve the roads leading south, and the Persian army moved slowly. The leisurely pace may have been a deliberate choice by the king to show his overwhelming force and compel wavering Greek states to submit to him without a fight. In the meantime, the leaders of the Greek coalition had met again to consider their strategic options. While Sparta's allies in the Peloponnesian League favoured remaining behind the fortifications that had been built across the Isthmus of Corinth, turning the Peloponnese into a stronghold, others, like Athens, were adamant that a defensive line much further north was needed. The wider Greek alliance consequently adopted a proposal by the representatives of Thessaly to send 10,000 men to the Vale of Tempe, which separated the Thessalians from their Macedonian neighbours to the north. However, upon its arrival the commanders were informed that the position could be outflanked and hurriedly withdrew, prompting the wavering Thessalians to submit to the Persians. By early August, it seemed as though the Greeks were set to fight at the Isthmus, which would mean abandoning Athens to its fate. The Greeks were also encumbered by their religious duties, with many city-states distracted by the religious festivals and sporting games held that year at Olympia, while the Spartans were observing the annual Carneia festival in honor of Apollo, one of the most important events on their religious calendar. In spite of this, and in response to a message from the Delphic oracle indicating that Sparta would fall unless one of its kings were to die in battle, one of its two reigning monarchs at the time, King Leonidas, led a few thousand men, including 300 elite Spartan soldiers, to Thermopylae, a narrow pass between the mountains and an inlet of the Aegean Sea. Leonidas knew that his small force could not win a decisive victory over the Persians, but it could still inflict heavy casualties on the attacking army and win time for the Greek allies to mount a defence behind the isthmus. Knowing that it would be a suicide mission, Leonidas required each of the 300 men to have a son to carry on the family line. Leonidas picked up some allied contingents on the way to Thermopylae, and by the time he arrived he had a force of some 7,000 men under his command. As Xerxes approached the pass in mid-August, he could see the Spartans taking part in nude exercises and washing their hair. When King Demaratus informed Xerxes that such rituals indicated that the Spartans were preparing to fight to the death, the Persian king laughed derisively. Nevertheless, Xerxes waited several days to launch his first attack at Thermopylae, perhaps expecting the Greeks to fall back as they had done so at Tempe. Alternatively, Xerxes may have known that it would cost him heavy casualties to overcome the Spartan defenders occupying the narrow pass, and preferred a diplomatic solution as he sent an envoy to the Greek camp asking Leonidas to submit and lay down his arms in return for fertile lands in the Persian Empire. The Spartan king refused by famously challenging Xerxes to come and take them. Leonidas took up his position at the so-called Middle Gate, the narrowest section of the pass, where he restored an old defensive wall to strengthen his position. On around the 17th of August, Xerxes ordered his men to begin their assault on Thermopylae. The terrain naturally favoured the Greeks, since it prevented Xerxes from using his numerical superiority to its full extent. Accustomed to fighting on open ground, the main weapon of the Persian infantry were their bows, which would unleash volley after volley of arrows to soften the enemy before the Persian cavalry maneuvered to strike at the flanks or to take advantage of gaps in the enemy defences created by the bowmen. In contrast, the Greek hoplites were heavily armoured with spears that gave them a longer reach than any of the Persian hand-to-hand weapons. The first Persian attack was launched by the Medes, the Persian arrows flying so thick that they allegedly blotted out the sun. The lightly armed Medes then closed in for the attack, but were repulsed by the Greek hoplites with heavy losses. Xerxes responded by throwing forward successive contingents of his multi-ethnic army into the attack, and though some of these were better suited to hand-to-hand combat, Leonidas's position remained impregnable. On occasion, Leonidas would order his men to stage feigned retreats in order to trap larger numbers of enemy troops in the pass. Infuriated at the lack of progress, Xerxes decided to send his immortals into the fray, but even they struggled to make progress against the formidable Greek defences. After 2 days of battle, a local shepherd informed Xerxes about a narrow mountain path that could be used to circumvent the Greek position. During the middle of the night, Hydarnes led his immortals over the road and overcame the weak Greek force guarding it. By the morning, they were approaching Leonidas's rear. In these desperate circumstances, Leonidas sent away any allied troops who did not wish to die and fought a last stand with his Spartans. The king led the 300 in front of the wall so they could deploy in a single line and attack the enemy in full force. According to Herodotus, 20,000 of Xerxes' men fell on the final morning of battle, but eventually the Spartans were killed one by one. After finding Leonidas's corpse, Xerxes ordered it to be mutilated and placed his head on a pole. Herodotus remarks that this was not a common practice among the Persians, suggesting that Xerxes was hugely angered by Leonidas's resistance and how costly defeating the Spartans at Thermopylae had proved. At around the same time, a naval action was fought at nearby Cape Artemisium to prevent another contingent of Xerxes' army from landing reinforcements at Thermopylae. The Persian fleet had already suffered considerable damage during a storm at Cape Sapias, resulting in the loss of around a third of the entire force. Although Themistocles had fewer than 300 triremes under his command, he adopted a circular formation with prows pointing outwards to make it impossible to outflank, and those Persian ships which attempted to do so were picked off in quick order. According to Herodotus, when Themistocles carved messages onto the rocks on the shore to persuade the Greek elements in the Persian fleet to defect, Xerxes responded by sending the Athenian naval commander a message inviting him to view the heaps of the unburied Greek dead at Thermopylae, warning that he would suffer a similar fate if he continued to fight. Although the Battle of Artemisium was tactically indecisive and the Persian navy was able to continue its southward progress, Themistocles had inflicted further losses upon the Persian fleet, which, in conjunction with the storm at Cape Sapias, reduced the Persian force to around half its initial size. Nevertheless, Xerxes maintained his numerical superiority on both land and sea and marched towards Athens with his main force. A Persian detachment was sent towards Delphi to plunder the sanctuary, but in an intervention credited to the god Apollo, a landslide at Mount Parnassus buried much of the Persian force alive, and the remainder fled from the scene. After securing the submission of the Boeotians in central Greece, Xerxes' army approached the Athenian heartland of Attica and proceeded to ravage the countryside. By this time, the city of Athens itself was largely empty. A delegation of Athenians had been to the oracle at Delphi and received a message which suggested that while the enemy would occupy the city, the Athenian population would be safe from the Persians behind its, quote, wooden wall. While a large number of Athenians believed that this meant they should rebuild a wooden wall around the Acropolis in the center of their city, Themistocles believed that the wooden wall referred to the Athenian navy. A large deposit of silver had recently been discovered at Laurium in southeast Attica, and Themistocles proposed this newfound wealth should be used to build a large fleet. The issue went to a vote in the Athenian assembly, which adopted Themistocles' proposals. When news arrived that Xerxes was marching south from Thermopylae, Themistocles put his plan into action. Almost the entire population of Athens was conscripted to man the fleet, though Themistocles retained a token garrison on the Acropolis. The Persians established a position on the Areopagus, the rocky hill below the Acropolis, which hosted the Athenian noble council, from where they shot fire arrows at the Athenian citadel. While the garrison initially prevented the Persians from approaching by rolling boulders down the path, a Persian force gained entry elsewhere by scaling up a vertical rock. Xerxes' army then burned all the religious buildings on the Acropolis, including the Temple of Athena and the Old Parthenon. In the aftermath of the battle in September 480 BC, Xerxes dispatched a message to Susa announcing that the aid Athens had provided to the Ionians at the time of their revolt, nearly 20 years earlier, had finally been avenged. The city of Athens lay in ruins, but Xerxes was premature in thinking he had defeated the Athenians entirely. With his surviving ships from the Battle of Artemisium and additional reinforcements from the other Greek allies, Themistocles awaited the Persian fleet at the island of Salamis in the Saronic Gulf, west of Athens and south of the Isthmus of Corinth, where the main Greek army had now assembled and was preparing to face an assault on land. Although the turncoat Spartan king Demaratus had advised Xerxes to split his fleet in two and send a squadron to land an army on the Peloponnese, the Persian naval commanders, with the exception of Queen Artemisia, favoured keeping the fleet together. According to Herodotus, Themistocles had 380 triremes at Salamis, while the Persian fleet could not have numbered more than 600. The Battle of Salamis began on a late September morning in 480 BC, not long after Xerxes had entered the burning ruins of Athens in seeming triumph. The right wing of the Greek fleet broke through the Persian line, and the rest of the Greek ships followed to encircle the enemy. With little room for maneuver in the narrow straits, the Phoenician ships bore the brunt of the action, and many were sunk. As he observed proceedings from a nearby hill, Xerxes must surely have struggled to believe what was happening. The Persian fleet was in disarray, and its commander, Ariobanes, had been killed in action. In order to get away, Artemisia had to ram one of her own ships, making the captain of an approaching Greek ship believe that hers was an allied ship. The defeat of the Persian fleet at Salamis not only caused Xerxes to abandon any thought of offensive action, but led him to fear that he and what remained of his army could now have their lines of supply cut off at the Hellespont. Panicking, he ordered a northwards retreat and did not try to engage the Greek land army at the Isthmus of Corinth. Thereafter, he hurried back to Persia, but the king left Mardonius behind in Thessaly with an army to resume the campaign the following spring. The rest of the army crossed back into Asia via the Hellespont and suffered considerably from lack of supplies and food as winter approached. Herodotus includes an anecdote concerning Xerxes' homeward journey, which indicates that the king made part of the homeward journey by ship, perhaps due to the lack of supplies on the land route. When the ship was caught up in a storm, the captain informed the king that the ship was overloaded and risked sinking. When Xerxes addressed the passengers and said they had an opportunity to demonstrate their concern for the safety of their king, most of the passengers allegedly jumped overboard, and the ship survived the crossing. After arriving safely in Asia, Xerxes gave the captain a gold crown for saving the king's life before executing him for causing the deaths of a shipload of Persians. Queen Artemisia had earlier advised Xerxes to return to his empire and to leave Mardonius and some 100,000 men behind. If Mardonius were to be successful, then the glory would belong to Xerxes for expanding his empire. If Mardonius were to be defeated or killed in battle, it would make little difference to the king and the Persian Empire. As far as Xerxes was concerned, he had sacked Athens, and that was enough of a victory for him to save face and claim some minimal victory at the least. When Mardonius began his campaign in around June 479 BC, after a long hiatus in the winter and spring of 479 BC, the Athenians once again evacuated the city, allowing the Persians to sack it for a second time. Rather than pressing on to the Peloponnese in late July, Mardonius decided to retreat to the friendly territory of Thebes. Although the Greeks had intended to fight a defensive battle at the isthmus, the Spartan general Pausanias now led a large army northwards and confronted Mardonius at Plataea, near Thebes. Pausanias staged a feigned retreat to encourage Mardonius to go on the offensive, before the Greek hoplites maintained their positions and cut down the Persian infantry, and the Persian commander was killed by a stone from a Spartan slinger. On the same day as the Battle of Plataea, a Greek fleet commanded by King Leotychidas of Sparta defeated the Persians at Mycale in Asia Minor. In an effort to avoid a repeat of Salamis, the Persian fleet had come ashore and established a fortified position at Mount Mycale, but the Greeks proceeded to set fire to both the Persians' ships and the fort at Mycale, massacring the defenders in the process. Since leaving Greece, Xerxes had remained at Sardis for a year. It was here that he received word of the twin defeats at Plataea and Mycale, following which he decided to abandon all thoughts of conquering Greece and returned to Susa. The second Persian invasion of Greece, which clearly involved a much larger army than the first a decade earlier, had ended in dramatic defeat for Xerxes. For the next 20 years, the Greeks launched frequent raids into Asia Minor, taking control of a handful of cities in the process, taking the fight to Xerxes. They also extensively celebrated the defeat of the Persian invasion as a great victory, with Thermopylae and Salamis in particular being hailed by the Spartans and Athenians as demonstrations of Greek martial prowess and the successful liberation of Greece from the despotic Oriental invader they perceived Xerxes as being. It was therefore natural for the Greek playwright Aeschylus to show the defeated Persian soldiers returning to Susa in rags at the end of the campaign in his play The Persians. However, some classical scholars speculate there may have been a Persian tradition that celebrated the second invasion of Greece in 480 BC and 479 BC as a victory. If Xerxes' primary motivation was to seek revenge for the Athenian sacking of Sardis, then the sacking of Athens in successive years had achieved that objective. But we should not be fooled. Xerxes had failed in his ultimate objective of conquering the Greek city-states entirely. As Xerxes turned his back on Greece, the Greeks also turned their backs on him, and despite the fact that Xerxes' reign lasted another 15 years, he hardly gets a mention in the Greek texts after 479 BC. As Herodotus and other writers fail to mention him thereafter, we consequently have very limited information concerning his later rule. We do know that in the aftermath of the Greek campaign, Xerxes turned his attention to another aspect of his father's unfinished work, the grand construction projects in the imperial capitals of Susa and Persepolis. The city of Persepolis was a relatively recent creation, and while the site may have been chosen by Cyrus, construction work was started in around 515 BC, early in the reign of Darius the Great. The earliest buildings on the site are the Great Stairway and the Apadana, the king's audience hall, which was modelled on a similar structure that had just been completed in Susa. These edifices were built on high ground above the plain, and in the early 5th century BC, work began on an artificial terrace at the same level, 15 metres above the ground, and faced with a limestone wall, creating a site 300 metres wide and 455 metres long. Xerxes probably began construction work in Persepolis immediately after becoming king, employing craftsmen from all over the empire to build and decorate the palaces. While Xerxes completed his father's unfinished buildings, his conception for the city was on an even grander scale. He blocked Darius's entrance in the south, and instead built an entrance to the northwest with a gentle incline leading towards the monumental Gate of All Nations, flanked by 2 winged bulls. The gateway is located at a right angle to the northern facade of the vast Apadana, completed by Xerxes, which could accommodate an estimated 10,000 people. The 2 staircases to the east and north, leading to the structure, bear inscriptions by Xerxes that stated, "Proclaims Xerxes the great king, by the favour of Ahura Mazda, my father Darius the king built and ordered to be built much that is beautiful, and similarly, by the will of Ahura Mazda, I added to that work and built more." The stairways are decorated with reliefs of processions of guards and foreign dignitaries bringing tribute from across the king's vast domains. The centre of each staircase featured an image of the king on his throne, facing to the right, with the crown prince following behind. There is no consensus on whether the king depicted is Darius, with Xerxes as crown prince behind him, or if Xerxes himself is occupying the throne. To the east of the Apadana stood another monumental public building of 70 square metres known as the Hall of 100 Columns, which remained unfinished at the end of Xerxes' reign, and which was only completed by his son and successor, Artaxerxes I. The edifice may have initially served as a hall for the king to receive his military commanders, but was later used as a storeroom for valuable artifacts. The palace of Darius, the king's private residence, is located in the southwestern corner of the palace complex and features images of Darius as king and Xerxes as crown prince. Throughout his construction work in Persepolis, Xerxes seems to have been motivated by a desire to outdo his father, and it was no different when it came to their private palaces. The palace of Xerxes is located opposite the palace of Darius and is twice as large, covered in inscriptions stating that Xerxes was responsible for its construction. The adjacent building to the east is known as the harem, since one of the images shows the king attended by a eunuch, but while the structure may have housed the royal women, Persian kings did not have the sort of harems later associated with the Ottoman sultans. While the Greeks claimed that the kings of Persia had 360 concubines, one for each day of the year, there is no evidence for this, and the tale may stem from Greek writers' desire to portray Persian kings as hedonists, more concerned with their carnal desires than the affairs of state. The vast treasury building, measuring 120 meters by 60 meters, is located at the southeastern corner of Persepolis. This was where the royal archives and gifts from tributaries were stored. This was one of the earliest buildings dating from the reign of Darius, though Xerxes made extensive alterations and opened a new entrance to the east. The central part of Persepolis is occupied by an enigmatic building, the function of which is unknown. As a result, it is known by a number of different names, including the Central Palace, the Council Hall, and the Tripolion, or Triple Gate. It could have simply served as a gate at the crossroads connecting the major buildings on the site, or it could have been a venue for the king to meet important officials. While construction was begun by Xerxes, it was completed by Artaxerxes, whose image is shown by all 4 doors. Despite all of Xerxes' monumental architecture, there is still some mystery surrounding the purpose of Persepolis. The fact that the city is rarely mentioned in the Greek sources until the 4th century BC gives the impression that it was not a center of political significance. The Iranian archaeologist Shadrach Razumjau argues that the city was entirely built for religious purposes, owing to the large number of inscriptions invoking Ahura Mazda. Other theories suggest that it was purely an administrative center or a fortified citadel that stored the wealth of the empire. Classical scholars like Richard Stoneman share the view that Persepolis was one of several capital cities that hosted the king for part of the year, but that there was a strong ceremonial and religious dimension to Persepolis, whose location in the Persian heartland, close to Cyrus's palaces, at Pasargadae was of symbolic importance to the Achaemenid dynasty. The early 20th century British statesman Lord George Curzon, who travelled through Persia as a young man and wrote about the history and politics of the region, eventually being made Viceroy of India, suggested that the king stayed in Persepolis in spring and held an annual ceremony to receive officials and tributaries at the start of the year, leading modern scholars to speculate that such ceremonies were related to Nowruz, or the Persian New Year. It has been argued that Xerxes' building work in Persepolis should be considered the major achievement of his reign. These monumental buildings would survive until 330 BC, when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and sacked the capital, supposedly in retribution for Xerxes' sacking of Athens 150 years earlier. Alexander seems to have deliberately targeted the palaces built by Xerxes, since Darius's palace remained largely unharmed. The Macedonian conqueror plundered the city's wealth, taking away 120,000 talents of gold and silver, carried by 3,000 camels and an unspecified number of mules. All of this was far into the future, but the Greeks continued to trouble Xerxes during his lifetime. The Greek alliance that had defeated Xerxes at Salamis and Plataea quickly broke up, with Sparta and Athens going their separate ways. Pausanias, the victor of Plataea, led a campaign in Asia Minor and captured the city of Byzantium, but he was soon seduced by Persian ways and ruled the city like a Persian satrap. This encouraged Xerxes to use Pausanias as his agent in Greece, but before he could do so, the Spartan general was recalled and eventually starved to death in captivity in around 476 BC. The other Greek hero, Themistocles, likewise ended up becoming a friend of Persia. He had made himself unpopular in Athens in the years following the end of the war and was ultimately ostracized from his native city. He eventually went to Persia. After arriving in Susa, he was received by the king, though the Greek sources are in conflict over whether this was Xerxes or his successor Artaxerxes I. At any rate, the king gave Themistocles the governorship of 3 estates in Asia Minor. According to the 1st century BC Greco-Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, Xerxes invited Themistocles to lead a new campaign into Greece. In 466 BC, after the Athenian general Cimon captured several cities in Asia Minor, Xerxes organized a force to confront the new threat. The armies clashed at the river Eurymedon in what is now southern Turkey, and Cimon won a decisive victory on land and sea. This was Xerxes' final campaign, and in early August 465 BC, he was assassinated in his bed, dying at the age of 53. All the Greek accounts attribute the murder to a man named Artabanus, an important military and political figure at Xerxes' court. In order to eliminate Xerxes' eldest son, the crown prince Darius, Artabanus told Artaxerxes that Darius had killed his father, prompting the young prince to kill his elder brother in response. Artaxerxes became king, and Artabanus may have served as regent for some time, but a few months later the new king eliminated Artabanus. A Babylonian tablet of the time states that Xerxes' son killed him and suggests that Artaxerxes may have used Artabanus as a scapegoat to cover up his own role in his father's death. The circumstances of Xerxes' death can also be connected with Herodotus's claim that soon after returning to Susa in 479 BC, Xerxes began an affair with his young daughter-in-law, Artainte, Darius's wife. If the affair had been carrying on for the rest of Xerxes' reign, both Darius and Xerxes' wife, Queen Amestris, would have had a motive to get rid of him. In this interpretation, Amestris was the mastermind of the whole plot, first plotting with Darius to kill Xerxes, and then enabling Artaxerxes to avenge his father. Artaxerxes would rule for the next 40 years, a time of general stability in the Persian Empire, despite the further loss.
Thank you for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.